These videos are based on real events, experiences, and accounts. However, all names, locations, and identifying details have been deliberately changed to protect the privacy and safety of those involved. Viewer discretion is advised.
Welcome back to the channel. These stories are meant for late nights, quiet rooms, and headphones on. Make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from tonight. Now, let's begin the first story. 3 years ago, my partner Elise and I bought our first house. It wasn't much, a narrow brick place on a quiet residential street just outside a mid-sized European city. 2 bedrooms, a small yard, no driveway, but it was ours, and after years of renting apartments with thin walls and bad neighbors, it felt like a win. What really sold us was the neighborhood. Everyone knew everyone. People waved from their windows, kids played on the sidewalk. Our next-door neighbors, an older couple named Johan and Mareike, brought us baked bread the day we moved in. They watched our dog when we worked late, we shared tools. It felt safe. So safe, in fact, that when Johan and Mareike told us they were selling their house a year and a half later, we didn't hesitate. Their place was bigger. It had a driveway, a garage, a bathtub instead of a shower stall. When they offered us the first chance to buy it, we jumped. We moved next door and put our old house up for sale immediately. That's when everything changed. We received several letters from potential buyers. One stood out. A polite couple from Eastern Europe, newly married, looking for a quiet place to settle down. They wrote warmly about starting a new life and caring for the home. When we met them, they seemed normal. The husband introduced himself as Piotr. His wife Anya stayed quiet but smiled often. They spoke English with us even though we spoke the local language. That didn't bother us. Plenty of people did that. We asked practical questions, where the boiler was, how the heating worked, whether the walls were insulated well. We shook hands, signed papers, and just like that, our old house next door belonged to them. The first few weeks were uneventful. Then the noises started. Not constantly, that would have been easier to explain. Instead, it was random. One night, heavy banging around midnight. Another night, music blasting so loud it vibrated our walls. Then silence for days. We told ourselves they were settling in. Different culture, different habits. But the feeling that something wasn't right crept in slowly, like damp spreading under wallpaper. The first real red flag came with Piotr's car. One afternoon, he pulled into the street and parked crookedly. When I looked closer, both sides of the car were scraped badly. Deep gouges, not minor damage, the kind you'd expect from a serious accident. I asked him if he was okay. He laughed nervously and said he'd hit a concrete post on one side and a trailer on the other. The explanation didn't make sense. The damage didn't line up. But again, I let it go. A few nights later, around 6 in the evening, my phone rang. It was Piotr. He sounded panicked, barely coherent. He said people were outside his house, turning his security cameras away. He begged me to come look and call the police. I stepped outside and felt my stomach drop. 2 men were out his front door. They weren't trying to hide. One was forcing the lock while the others stood lookout, calm, methodical, like they'd done this before. I called the police immediately. It took them 20 minutes to arrive. By then, the men were gone. Anya came running out of the house screaming for their dog. She parked in the middle of the street and rushed inside. The police searched but found nothing missing. While all this was happening, I noticed something odd. Piotr wasn't there. A few minutes later, I saw him walking towards the house from 3 streets away, alone, hands in pockets, as if he'd parked his car somewhere else on purpose. At the time, I didn't connect the dots. Later that night, Elise checked our old doorbell camera footage out of curiosity. What we saw made my skin crawl. One of the burglars had stood at the door earlier that day, speaking calmly in Polish, discussing which house to target, pointing. Nothing was taken, no arrests were made. The police shrugged it off. I told them it felt staged. They never followed up. A week later, Elise was at work and I was at a friend's homewarming party. Around 9, she texted me, "The music next door is insane again." 10 minutes later, she called me. Her voice was shaking. "They just drove through our front garden." I left immediately. By the time I got back, police lights filled the street. Piotr's car had smashed through our hedges and slammed directly into his own front door. The front of the house was destroyed. The car was still running. 2 men were loading it with electronics, big TVs, professional sound equipment, things that didn't belong in that small house. The police arrived fast this time, 7 minutes. They approached the men, asked for ID. None of them had any. Then the driver did something chilling. He told the officer his name was Piotr, used the exact name of our neighbor. But this man spoke the local language fluently, with a thick Polish accent, something Piotr had never once done in the 9 months we knew him. The officer immediately realized what was happening. The men panicked. The car lurched forward, and a violent chase tore through our quiet neighborhood. Sirens, screeching tires, chaos where there had once been silence. They were caught minutes later. As officers returned to the house, they heard movement inside. They dragged out a 3rd man. That should have been the end. It wasn't. While we were inside our new house filing a damage report, the doorbell rang. I turned around, and there stood Piotr, the real one. His face was unrecognizable, swollen, bloody, one eye completely shut, his mouth split, his arm hanging uselessly at his side, covered in what looked like defensive wounds. He didn't look human anymore. He looked hunted. We stood frozen in the hallway, staring at Piotr. For a second, none of us spoke. Elise had one hand over her mouth. I remember noticing how quiet the street suddenly was. No sirens, no voices, just the faint hum of the streetlight outside. Piotr swayed where he stood. I grabbed his shoulder before he could fall. Up close, the damage was worse than I'd thought. His face was swollen beyond recognition. One cheekbone looked wrong, like it had been pushed inward. His knuckles were raw and split, nails cracked and bloody. There were bruises on his neck, deep purple fingerprints that told a very specific story. He whispered, "They're still out there." We pulled him inside and locked the door. Elise grabbed towels and ice packs. I sat Piotr down on the kitchen chair. He flinched every time we moved too fast. Every sound made him jerk his head toward the window. I asked him what happened. At first, he couldn't speak. His jaw trembled. His breathing came in short, sharp gasps like he was afraid to take a full breath. Then he told us everything. The men we'd seen, the burglars, the chase, they weren't strangers. They were family. Cousins, childhood friends, men he'd grown up with back home, people he'd trusted. They'd come to the country together with one plan: buy a house, use it as a base, stage robberies, insurance scams, move stolen goods across borders, then disappear. Piotr and Anya were meant to be the clean ones, the faces, the couple with paperwork and a believable story, but something had gone wrong. Anya had wanted out. She'd met someone at a language class, a woman who helped refugees settle in, someone who talked about normal jobs, normal lives, someone who asked questions. Piotr said Anya started panicking, talking about police, about leaving. The others didn't like that. That night, while the burglars were breaking into their own house, Piotr had been dragged into a van parked 3 streets away, beaten, interrogated, threatened. They wanted to know if he'd talked. He hadn't. But Anya had. She'd gone to the police earlier that week, not with names, not with details, just enough to make the men nervous. They'd taken her. "She's gone," Piotr whispered. "They took her this morning." Elise started crying quietly. I felt something cold settle in my chest. The police came back after an hour. They took Piotr to the hospital, asked questions, wrote things down, promised to investigate. But I could tell by their tone that they already considered the case half closed. Foreign criminals, complicated jurisdictions, no immediate danger now that arrests had been made. Before they left, one officer told us to be cautious for a few days, as if caution meant anything. That night, neither Elise nor I slept.
Every sound outside made us sit up. Every car passing slowed my heart to a crawl. I checked the locks 3 times, then 4. At around 3:10 a.m., Elise shook me awake. She said, "Someone's outside." I listened. At first, I heard nothing. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, careful, moving through gravel. I peeked through the upstairs window. A man stood across the street, half hidden by a parked car. He wasn't looking at our house. He was looking at the old one, the one Pietra and Anya lived in. He raised his phone and took a picture, then another. I called the police. By the time they arrived, the man was gone. The next morning, we noticed our old house's front door had been forced open again. Nothing was taken, but something had been left behind. A single glove, black, leather, medium-sized. Inside the glove was a folded piece of paper. A name was written on it. Anya. The police took it seriously this time. They searched the house, the street, questioned neighbors, put patrols through the area, but no one was found. Days passed, then weeks. The house next door stayed empty, windows boarded up, front door sealed like a mouth stitched shut. Pietra survived, but he never came back to the neighborhood. We heard he moved to a shelter outside the city. He refused to testify, refused protection, just vanished. The case stalled. Life tried to return to normal, but normal never really comes back after something like that. About 2 months later, Elise was home alone. I was working late. She called me at 8:42 p.m. Her voice was flat, too calm. "There's someone in the old house," she said. I told her to lock the door and go upstairs. She said she already had. I drove home faster than I ever had in my life. When I turned onto our street, I saw light coming from one window of the old house, a single room, flickering. Police were already there. They'd found someone inside, not alive. The body was discovered in the basement crawlspace, wrapped in plastic and old insulation. The smell had been contained by the sealed house, preserved. It was Anya. The official cause of death was blunt force trauma. The unofficial conclusion was worse. She'd been kept alive for days. The men responsible were never officially identified. The ones arrested after the car chase were released due to lack of evidence. Different names, fake documents, no solid links. The case went cold. We sold both houses 6 months later, moved to a different city, different country. For a long time, I told myself it was over, until last year. I received a message on social media with an account, no photo, just one sentence. "You should have minded your own house." I blocked it. Then another arrived a week later. A photo. It was of our current home, taken from across the street, at night. I don't live next to strangers anymore. I live next to silence. And silence, I've learned, can hide anything.
I hike alone often enough that I don't think about it anymore. Solitude used to feel like a choice, a luxury, a way to get out of my own head. That night, I told myself I was doing the same thing I always did. Short drive, familiar trail, a few hours of quiet before heading back. I didn't plan to stay overnight. That's important. The trailhead was already empty when I arrived, which wasn't unusual for a weekday evening. The fog, it started rolling in from the valley below, thin at first, like smoke that couldn't decide where to go. I checked the weather again on my phone. Clear skies, low visibility warnings, nothing dramatic. I locked my car, adjusted my pack, and stepped onto the trail just before sunset. The first mile was easy, flat, wide enough for 2 people to walk side by side. The forest was quiet in that dull way that comes right before night settles in. No birds, no insects, just the sound of my boots and my own breathing. About 20 minutes in, I smelled something strange. Not rot, not smoke. Something sharp and metallic, almost sweet. It came and went as I walked, drifting in and out of the fog. I told myself it was wet leaves or exposed rock. Forests smell weird when the temperature drops fast. Still, I slowed down. That was when I saw the light. A single white beam high up on the ridge to my left. At first I thought it was another hiker, someone higher on the switchbox. But the angle was wrong. The light wasn't moving steadily. It flickered, vanished, reappeared farther to the right. There wasn't a trail up there. I knew this area well enough to be sure of that. I stood still, watching. The light stopped. Then, slowly, it swept downward, not searching, not scanning, pointed directly at me. I felt exposed in a way that didn't make sense, like I'd stepped into a room where someone had been waiting in the dark. I waved my hand and called out, "Hey, you all right up there?" No answer. The light clicked off. I waited another full minute before continuing, telling myself I was overthinking it. People do weird things. Maybe someone camping illegally, maybe someone messing around. But the smell came back stronger as I walked. By the time the trail narrowed and began to climb, the fog had thickened enough that I could barely see 20 feet ahead. My headlamp reflected back at me, turning every tree trunk into a vague human shape if I looked too fast. That was when I heard the whistle. One sharp note. Then another. Not a tune, not a call, just sound. I stopped again. "Hello?" I called. The forest swallowed my voice. A moment later, I heard footsteps. Not behind me, ahead. Slow, deliberate, crunching leaves in a pattern that matched mine exactly, just delayed by a few seconds. I turned off my headlamp. The footsteps stopped. My heart started hammering in my chest so hard it made my ears ring. I stood there, barely breathing, counting seconds in my head. 10. 20. 30. Then a soft sound, almost too quiet to notice. Something scraping stone. I turned my light back on and stepped forward just far enough to see what was blocking the trail. 3 stones, stacked carefully in the center of the path. I hadn't passed them on the way up. Someone had placed them there while I was standing in the dark. That was the moment I decided to turn back. I didn't run. Running makes noise. Running makes you blind. I walked fast, keeping my headlamp low, listening. After a few minutes, I started to calm. Then I heard breathing. Close. Too close to be carried by fog. I spun around, light flashing through the trees. Nothing. But the smell was overwhelming now, sharp and coppery, like old blood on cold metal. "Stop," a voice said softly. It came from my right. I froze. The voice wasn't angry, it wasn't loud. It sounded patient. "I'm just hiking, didn't mean to get in your way." Silence. Then footsteps again, this time circling. I turned slowly, trying to keep the light moving. Fog warped everything. Depth vanished, trees blended together. "I know you," the voice said. My stomach dropped. "That's not possible," I said. "You hike here a lot." It wasn't a question. I backed up, heel catching on a root. I almost fell. When I steadied myself, the voice was closer. I could hear breath now, wet, controlled. "Don't turn around," he said. "You'll slip." Something in the way he said it told me he was smiling. I ran. The trail vanished almost immediately. Fog swallowed the path, branches clawing at my arms.
I didn't care where I was going anymore. I just needed distance. Behind me, branches snapped. Not chasing, following. I reached a clearing by instinct, stumbled into open space and spun around with my light raised. The light landed on him. He stood at the edge of the trees, half in fog, half out. Middle-aged, dirty jacket, bare hands despite the cold. He raised his own flashlight and pointed it at the ground between us. Slowly, he whistled once, then twice. From somewhere behind me, a third whistle answered. And that's when I understood. I was never alone on that trail, and they had been guiding me the entire time.
I didn't turn around. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to look, to confirm how many of them there were, where they stood, how close they were. But something deeper, quieter, told me that once I turned, I wouldn't be allowed to turn back. The third whistle echoed again, closer this time. "Easy," the man in front of me said. His voice hadn't changed, calm, measured, like we were negotiating a parking spot, not my life. "You wandered off the trail, happens all the time." I scanned the clearing with my peripheral vision. Fog pressed in from all sides, dulling sound and distance. The trees formed a loose ring around us, thick enough that I couldn't see more than a few feet past the first row of trunks. "How many of you are there?" I asked. He chuckled softly. "Does it matter?" My fingers tightened around the strap of my pack. Inside was a small folding knife buried under a water bottle and extra layers. Getting to it would take time I didn't have. Behind me, something shifted. A footstep, careful not to snap twigs. "Stay where you are," the man said. "You've had a long walk." I took a step backward anyway. He sighed, like I disappointed him. "That's the problem with regulars," he said. "You get comfortable, you stop noticing what changes." The smell hit me again, stronger than ever. Not just metal now, something sour layered beneath it. People won't notice you're gone until morning. Even then, they'll search the trail, not out here. My heels slid against damp leaves. I nearly lost my footing, caught myself, then deliberately shifted my weight forward. And then I ran. Not straight, not blindly. I bolted toward the densest cluster of trees, swinging my headlamp wildly, smashing through underbrush without caring about noise or pain. Branches scraped my face and arms. Roots snagged my boots. Behind me, they shouted. Not angry, excited. Footsteps pounded after me now, no longer hiding. I heard at least 2 distinct sets, maybe 3. Someone laughed when I tripped and rolled down a shallow slope, scraping my palms raw on stone. I scrambled back to my feet and kept going. The ground dipped suddenly and I slid again, this time intentionally, letting gravity carry me downhill until I slammed into something solid. Wood. A structure. I staggered back and raised my light. It was a hunting cabin. Old, half-rotted, barely standing. The door hung crooked on rusted hinges, but it was still attached. I slammed into it and shoved. It opened. I dove inside and kicked the door shut behind me just as something hit it from the outside. The impact rattled the walls. I braced myself against the door, heart hammering, lungs burning. The cabin smelled worse than the forest. Mold, rust, and underneath it all, that same sharp, metallic scent. "Open up," someone called, voice playful now. I scanned the room desperately. One small window, too high, too narrow. A broken table, a pile of old tarps in the corner. No lock on the door. The handle began to turn. I grabbed the table and dragged it across the floor, wedging it under the handle just as the door burst inward. Wood splintered. The table lurched but held. For a moment, everything went quiet. Then the man spoke again, right on the other side of the door. "You really shouldn't have come in here." My eyes adjusted to the dim interior. That was when I saw the stains. Dark, uneven patches soaked into the floorboards, scratch marks along the wall at knee height. Something small and round on the table that hadn't registered before. A tooth. The table jolted again, harder this time.
The wood cracked. I backed away, hands shaking, finally yanking the knife from my pack. It felt laughably small in my grip. The window shattered. Glass sprayed across the floor as a hand reached through, fingers clawing at empty air. I lunged forward and slashed, catching skin. The hand withdrew with a sharp cry. The door gave way at the same moment. The table snapped aside and the man from the clearing stepped in, light flooding the cabin. His jacket was stained dark across the chest and sleeves. Not dirt, blood. Behind him, 2 others crowded the doorway. I didn't think. I moved. I sprinted past them, slamming my shoulder into one, slashing wildly with the knife. I felt it connect with something soft. Someone screamed. I burst out into the fog and ran again. This time, the terrain worked in my favor. The ground dropped sharply, forcing them to slow down. I slid, rolled, tore through brush, following the slope until the forest thinned and I burst out onto gravel. The road. I didn't stop running until my boots hit pavement. Headlights appeared through the fog. I stepped into the road, waving my arms, screaming until my throat burned. The car skidded to a stop, just short of hitting me. The driver stared at me like a ghost. I don't remember what I said, not clearly, just fragments. People, chasing, cabin. They took me to the ranger station. Search teams went out that night. They found the cabin. Inside were tools, old ropes, bones buried behind the structure, scattered like they'd been there a long time. They never found the men. The ranger told me later that hikers had gone missing in that area for years, not often enough to make headlines, just enough to be dismissed as accidents, wrong turns, falls, exposure. I don't hike alone anymore, and when I walk in the woods now, I listen carefully. Not for footsteps, for whistles, because if you hear one, it means you've already been seen. When my parents first told me we were moving, I was 15, and I remember feeling a strange mix of excitement and anxiety. Our old apartment in suburban Alberta had been fine for a family of 3, but with my little sister on the way, space was becoming a real issue. We found a house just a few blocks away, older, a little worn, but affordable and with room to grow. At first, it felt like luck had landed in our laps. My parents spent weeks renovating the basement, carpeting the floors, fixing the bathroom, and giving me the chance to choose wallpaper for my new room. I was thrilled. Everything about this new home seemed perfect, especially the basement, which would eventually become my room. It was spacious, tucked away, and felt like a small private world. For the first few months, life in the new house was seamless. I loved the independence of having my own space, and my sister's arrival only added to the sense of home. Nights were quiet, and I often stayed up late playing on my Nintendo DS or watching videos on my tablet. I never thought much of the creaks and groans that older houses naturally make. But the first odd moment came one night when we returned from a dinner for my father's birthday. Everything seemed normal until we stepped inside and noticed the front door wide open. My mom panicked immediately, urging my dad to drive us away while she called the police. He grabbed a heavy wrench from the truck and went inside to check. The officers arrived shortly after, but no one was in the house. Nothing was stolen. Still, some items were shifted, a few books knocked over on my shelf. The experience unsettled me, but I convinced myself it was just a break-in attempt with no serious consequences. After that night, small things began happening sporadically. I'd hear faint footsteps in the walls or strange noises from beneath the basement floor. My room was at ground level in the basement, adjacent to the utility area with a large window overlooking the backyard. The window had vertical blinds, several panels missing, so even when they were closed, I could see through the gaps. On the other side, mirrored closet doors reflected the window, meaning I could always see outside from my bed. I remember the first time I noticed something truly strange. It was late, maybe around 11:30 p.m., and I had left my tablet on the bed while lying under the covers. I paused my video when I thought I heard shuffling outside the window. For a few moments, the noises stopped. I reasoned that it was probably the wind, or maybe my imagination. But then, through the reflection in the mirror, I thought I saw a shadow move. I jumped up and ran to wake my parents. My dad went outside to check the backyard while my mom tried to calm me down. He came back a few minutes later, shaking his head. There was nothing there. No footprints, no intruders, nothing unusual. My mom insisted it must have been my imagination. I wanted to believe her, but a chill ran down my spine that night. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing patterns: footsteps, faint breathing, occasional shuffling. I avoided looking directly at the window or the mirror, convincing myself it was my imagination. And for a while, it seemed that was all it was. The sounds would stop when the weather got colder and I could focus on my games and videos without incident. The following spring, the noises returned. By now, my little sister shared the basement with me, and my parents kept baby monitors in the kitchen and living room. One night, while my parents were out for dinner, I heard heavy footsteps coming from the basement while watching a movie in the living room. My heart nearly stopped when I realized my sister's baby monitor had fallen over, and I could hear faint shushing sounds and a small crash. I ran to the basement, clutching my father's rifle. Of course, it wasn't loaded and the trigger lock was still on, but I hoped it would be enough to scare anyone off. I imagined the worst: someone had entered the house while we were alone. I descended the basement steps slowly, calling out. The crib was empty, the baby monitor on the floor, but no one else was there. I scooped my sister into my arms and barricaded the basement door with a chair, calling my parents immediately. The police arrived before they did, and I explained everything. Once inside, the officer inspected the house and, to my horror, discovered the hidden space behind my built-in bookshelf. It opened like a door, revealing a small, hidden room. Inside were the remnants of someone living there: food wrappers, an old cup, lotion, a switchblade, and even a partially eaten apple. The room was small, dark, and suffocating. Most terrifying of all was a tiny hole in the wall that directly faced my bed. Someone had been watching me, my sister, our daily routines, every private moment. From that day forward, my sense of safety in the house evaporated. I avoided the basement, kept my blinds fully closed, and refused to look at the mirrored closet doors. The idea that someone had been living feet away from me for months, unseen and unknown, was almost impossible to comprehend. The intruder knew my habits, the layout of the house, and even the moments when my parents were out. The thought that our private life had been observed so closely left me feeling exposed and violated. I could barely sleep, and every creak of the house or whisper of wind outside sent me into a panic. In the months that followed, my parents installed additional cameras and security measures, but the sense of unease never fully lifted. I would hear noises from the basement, footsteps that didn't belong, and occasional shuffling in the walls. I began to notice missing items that later turned up in strange places, as if the intruder had left them intentionally to remind us that they had been there. It was subtle but deliberate. My sister and I were hyper-aware of every sound, every shadow. Even something as simple as the creak of a floorboard would make my heart race, knowing what we had discovered. Looking back, the scariest part wasn't just that someone had been living in our house, it was how long they had gone undetected. Months of observation, undisturbed and hidden, allowed them to understand our routines in a way that was deeply unsettling. Our house, which had once felt safe and comfortable, became a trap where someone could watch and manipulate from the shadows. Even now, I can remember the exact feeling of looking through my closet mirror and realizing I could see the window reflection. It was a reminder that our privacy had been completely compromised. That experience fundamentally changed how I viewed personal safety. I became hyper-aware of locks, security systems, and blind spots in the house. Every sound was suspicious, every shadow was a potential threat. My parents were supportive, but even they were shaken, realizing how close we had come to a real danger. The police never caught the intruder, and we were left with the horrifying knowledge that someone had been living inside our home without our knowledge. That invisible presence, lurking just behind walls, furniture, and hidden spaces, left a permanent scar on our sense of security. Even after I moved out and started living independently, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. My new apartment had security cameras and locks on every door, yet I remained vigilant, constantly checking my surroundings. The sense of paranoia that once felt excessive now seemed justified. Our home had been invaded, and while the intruder never returned, the knowledge that it could happen again lingered. Every creak, every shadow, every unexplained noise carries a weight of possibility. The realization that someone could exist so close, so hidden without our knowledge is what continues to haunt me. What started as ordinary household noises turned into a nightmare where safety was an illusion. The intruders' cleverness, their patience, and their ability to observe without detection made me feel powerless. And the small hole in the wall that faced my bed remains in my memory as a symbol of vulnerability. It's a chilling reminder that even in the comfort of your own home, you are never truly alone. That night in the basement, the discovery behind the bookshelf, and the months of unnoticed presence, all of it crystallized into a single terrifying truth. Someone had lived in our house, had watched me grow up in my own room, and had vanished without a trace. The idea that our routines, our movements, our private lives were all visible to a stranger is something I still struggle to comprehend. It's a lesson in vigilance and the fragility of perceived safety. And though time has passed, I'll never forget that sense of someone being inches away, watching silently, always present.
The days after the discovery behind the bookshelf were tense, almost unbearable. My parents tried to maintain normalcy, but the air in the house felt permanently heavy. Every sound, a creak in the floor, the hum of the fridge, even the wind rattling the blinds, set our nerves on edge. We installed extra cameras, motion sensors, and reinforced locks, yet the unease never lifted. I slept with a small lamp on, keeping the door to my room closed, watching shadows as if expecting them to move. My sister, still too young to understand, sensed my anxiety but couldn't articulate it. She cried at strange times, seemingly without reason, and I would lie awake listening for any sound from behind the walls. A few nights later, during a particularly cold December evening, I heard noises again, distinct footsteps, lighter this time, but deliberate, moving toward the basement. My heart pounded in my chest. I wanted to call out, to alert my parents, but some irrational part of me feared provoking whoever or whatever was still in the house. The basement door, which I had reinforced with a chair earlier, was now bolted, but I could hear the soft scuff of shoes against the floor. I grabbed a flashlight and my father's old baseball bat, creeping quietly toward the stairs. The hair on my arms stood up as I peered into the basement darkness. Everything seemed undisturbed. Still, the sense of presence was undeniable. That same week, small, inexplicable events began stacking up. My homework would go missing and reappear in odd places. Books I had carefully arranged would be slightly tilted or moved entirely. Once, I found a note folded neatly and tucked inside my notebook that I swore I hadn't seen before. In messy, blocky handwriting, it simply said, "I see you." I froze, unable to breathe. The note felt fresh, as if it had been left just moments before. I showed it to my parents, who were both horrified and angry. They demanded that the police be contacted again. When they came, the officer was puzzled but agreed that someone could still have been hiding in the house or entering unseen. They recommended we stay elsewhere temporarily, at least until the situation was resolved. For the next few nights, my parents arranged for my sister and me to stay with a neighbor, an older couple who lived a few streets away. At first, it felt like a relief to sleep in a safe, quiet environment, but even there, I couldn't shake the paranoia. Every creak in the neighbor's house made me flinch. My mind kept returning to the tiny room behind the bookshelf, to the hole in the wall through which I had been observed. I realized just how intimate the intruder's knowledge had been. They had watched me while I slept, had tracked my routines, and had probably known when my parents left for work or errands. That realization made me feel profoundly exposed, as if the invasion had never truly ended. A week later, my parents returned home with me cautiously. They had installed cameras throughout the basement and reinforced all entry points, even the tiny gaps in the windows and doors. For the first night back, I stayed awake, flashlight in hand, watching the screens. Hours passed, nothing moved, and slowly I began to relax. But then, just after midnight, the monitor in my room lit up. A faint, shadowy figure appeared in the basement, lingering near the hidden room. My hands froze around the flashlight. The figure didn't move far, just hovered for a moment before vanishing from the camera's view. I called my parents immediately. My dad grabbed the rifle and cautiously descended into the basement with me following close behind. When we opened the door to the hidden room, it was empty. There were no signs of recent habitation, no food wrappers, no objects out of place. But the air felt different,
heavier somehow, as though someone had just left. I realized that this person had either returned in secret or had never truly left. The thought made my stomach twist. For the next few days, my parents took turns staying with me in the basement at night, monitoring every creak, every shadow. Yet nothing concrete happened. It was a living nightmare where the terror was always present, but the threat remained invisible. Several months later, the situation escalated in a way that would haunt me forever. One evening, I came home from school and noticed subtle signs of tampering around the house. Small scratches on the basement door, slight scuff marks on the floorboards leading to the hidden room. I froze. My stomach dropped, and I immediately checked my sister's room and my parents' bedroom. Everyone was accounted for, but the evidence was there. Someone had been inside while we were gone. My parents were beside themselves with fear and frustration. The police were notified again, but no intruder was found. It became clear that whoever had been living in our house had an intimate understanding of its layout, knew how to avoid detection, and perhaps even knew our habits better than we did ourselves. One night, around 1 a.m., I awoke to a faint rustling sound near my bed. I froze, remembering the hole in the hidden room. My flashlight revealed nothing, but then I noticed the slight movement of my dresser, just enough to suggest someone had touched it. My heart raced. I screamed for my parents, who came running. We searched every corner, but once again, the intruder was gone. My dad realized something terrifying. The person had likely been hiding in the walls or ceilings, small enough and cunning enough to remain unseen, coming out only when we were distracted. The realization that someone had been living inside our home undetected for so long hit us like a punch. We had shared our most private space with a stranger, and that stranger had vanished without a trace. The final straw came a few weeks later in early spring. My parents were at work, my sister at school, and I was home alone. I had just finished my homework and was preparing dinner when I heard faint scratching from behind the walls. At first, I froze, convincing myself it was the house settling, or perhaps a raccoon in the attic. But the scratching continued, deliberate, slow, methodical. My stomach turned. I followed the sound to the basement, flashlight trembling in my hand. As I descended the stairs, the light flickered slightly. Then I saw it, a shadow moving just inside the hidden room, almost human, almost normal, but unnervingly silent. I dropped the flashlight in shock, and it clattered loudly against the floor. The shadow vanished instantly. I called my parents in a panic. My dad rushed home, accompanied by a police officer who had been assigned to our neighborhood patrol. We entered the basement together, shining flashlights into every corner. Nothing, no evidence of someone currently inside, but the intruder had left their mark in subtler ways. Objects moved, faint handprints smudged in dust, and small scratches on the walls. They had been here. They could be back. It was a chilling confirmation that the horror was far from over. That night, I slept in the living room with my sister under my arm, flashlight in hand, convinced that the intruder could appear at any moment. In the days that followed, my parents made the difficult decision to move temporarily to a nearby apartment until we could fully secure the house. We replaced windows, sealed the hidden room completely, and added reinforced doors throughout the basement. Even with all these measures, the fear lingered. The thought that someone had been living just inches away, unseen and unnoticed, never left me. Every creak, every shadow, every gust of wind through the blinds reminded me of the intruder's presence. Even after the hidden room was sealed, I couldn't shake the sense that the house itself remembered, that it held the memory of a stranger who had invaded our lives in the most intimate way possible. Years later, even now as an adult living in my own apartment, I can't forget those nights in the basement. I often wake up in the middle of the night, convinced I hear footsteps just outside my bedroom door or a shadow flickering across the wall. The thought that someone could observe you from inches away, entirely unseen, is a terror that never truly fades. The intruder's identity remains unknown. The motivations behind their actions, whether curiosity, obsession, or something darker, are a mystery. The one thing I do know is that our sense of safety, the sanctity of our home, was irrevocably shattered. Looking back, I realize how close we came to real danger. At any point, the intruder could have decided to confront us, to reveal themselves in a way far more sinister than mere observation. The months of living alongside an invisible presence were a trial that tested our nerves, our trust, and our understanding of safety. The experience left a lasting impression on me, shaping the way I view security, privacy, and vigilance. Even with every precaution we took, I understood that sometimes the most dangerous threats are the ones you cannot see. I have since moved far away from that house. My parents eventually returned, though they remain wary, keeping cameras and motion sensors active to this day. The hidden room behind the bookshelf remains sealed, a silent reminder of what had once been. But the fear that someone could live in your space without your knowledge, watching every move, is a lesson I carry with me daily. It is the kind of terror that doesn't fade with distance, a permanent shadow that lingers in memory. The intruder may never have returned, but their presence, real, intimate, and terrifying, still lives in my mind, a haunting reminder that sometimes your worst fears can exist in the spaces you think are safest.